Hello everyone, welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Ania Kolbuszewska and my workshop today is about creativity in the English language classroom. Kevin O'Connor, the author of the book The Map of Innovation, is the person who helped create DoubleClick, an innovative marketing technology company. He also created 2 software companies and dozens of products, including DVD, which of course now is disappearing. In his book, he repeats after the famous inventor Thomas Edison that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Now, of course, this does not mean that inspiration or the creative moment is not important, even if it only accounts for 1% of innovation. And the importance of creativity is why we're talking about it today. In language teaching, creativity is at the core of what we do in the classroom. Luke Meddings, an ELT author, says that creativity is part of being human, and that although it cannot be one of those things that you tick off on the course syllabus, it still needs to be embedded in everything that we do. And I would like us to start our discussion about creativity by talking about some very prevalent myths about creativity. The first myth is that creativity is something that you either have or don't have. And that means that if you were born with this, let's call it creativity gene, then you will have all these creative ideas. You might perhaps be an artist or an inventor. But if you happen to be born without this creativity gene, then it's just your bad luck. You simply won't have a chance at being creative or innovative. And then there are other myths. First of all, that in addition to only some people being creative, creativity is restricted to only some activities, such as, for example, art. We also often think about creative ideas as big and complex. And in terms of how our brain works, a lot of people will say that creativity is the product of the brain's right hemisphere. So innovative people are considered right brain thinkers, while left brain thinkers are people who are thought to be analytical and logical. And so before we can really talk about creativity in the context of English language teaching, we need to take a very critical look at these myths. First of all, creativity is not binary, so we either have it or don't have it. In fact, we all have it. We are all creative. There are, of course, certain personality traits that will help. So, for example, if you are a risk taker and if you are more open to new experiences. There's also a little bit of biology that can help. If your brain has a genetic predisposition to produce and use more serotonin, you will probably be slightly more creative. But checking if we have the right genetic makeup for a slightly higher creativity is probably useless if you don't practice creativity. So if you think about the personality, the genetic makeup, the experience and amount of practice, you will probably agree with me that creativity is as diverse as people. And this also means that there is no ideal creativity. When it comes to the brain, creativity is not a right or left brain thing. In fact, there are over 40 areas of the brain which are involved in creativity. And a very good proof for that is that artists who have suffered partial damage to their brains continue producing similar art to what they did before the brain damage. One thing that I would really like to draw your attention to is the difference between creativity and creating. Creativity is used in creating, but also in finding solutions, including solutions to everyday problems, thinking of new ways of doing something, organizing something better, or making decisions. And in all these situations, you may not be creating, but you're certainly creative. And it's also very important to remember that creativity is a skill and that it can be learned and improved with practice. Adam Grant was a Harvard graduate who was inspired to research people who have created or invented something very innovative. So how did this happen? In 2001, Adam Grant's Harvard roommate dreamed up this idea for an internet platform that would allow people to connect with their friends and to share updates on their life's events. But he never did anything about that idea. And a few years later, Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook in the dorm literally next door. So Adam Grant decided to study people who have created or invented something very innovative. And he came to the conclusion that most of them are surprisingly ordinary. And this is what he described in his book, Originals: How Nonconformists Change the World. But also while carrying out his research, he created some pointers or tips on how to increase your creativity. And we will come to these tips a little bit later in the session. Creativity has been analyzed scientifically for decades. It's been written about by psychologists, educationalists, sociologists, and of course we don't have time to discuss all that has been written and said about creativity, and we will only focus on the issues which have a practical value for us, the teachers and the trainers. Now, one of the key issues in the science of creativity are the 4 Ps: people, process, place, and product. So who is creative? What process does creativity involve? What places are most conducive to creativity? And what is the outcome of a creative process? Now, we said that when it comes to people, scientists and everyone else used to think that creativity was a characteristic of only some people, the creative people. We know now that everyone can be creative given the right conditions. So right now, what we want to know is how to replicate the creative process. Now, we're going to look at the process itself in a moment, but first of all, let's go over a practical classroom idea, which is very much connected with creativity and creating, and which harnesses these two, creativity and creating, in the process of improving language skills. I'm sure that you can all recognize this picture. It is, of course, Mona Lisa, and the painting is probably one of the most easily recognizable pictures in the world. Getting students to look at the picture and tell you who the lady is a very good lead-in to a series of activities which practice a range of skills and language systems. So here is my suggestion for using this picture in a sequence of activities. First, tell your students to think of 3 reasons why Mona Lisa is smiling, and they will do this on their own. Once they've come up with the 3 reasons, they can compare the reasons in pairs or in small groups. And they talk about the reasons that they have come up with, and then they choose the 3 best reasons out of the 6 or the 9 that they have together. But here you can also organize a pyramid discussion where first students negotiate the best 3 reasons in groups of 3. Then each group of 3 negotiates the 3 best reasons with another group of 3. Then you have groups of 6 who negotiate the best 3 reasons, and so on, until you have one list of reasons for the whole class, or if you're working with a really large class, for example, for half the class. Now, the next step that I would like to suggest is, in fact, another activity which uses the image of Mona Lisa. You give out a handout, and this is a handout that you can see on the screen, and you ask students to complete the picture in any way they want. The only condition is that they mustn't show their artistic creation to their neighbors while they're still working. When they have finished, they share their pictures in pairs or small groups, and they talk to their partners about why they've created this kind of picture, what it represents to them, and, for example, what they like in their partner's picture or pictures. Another possibility would be one student describing their creation to their partner, and the partner has to draw this picture without looking at the original. Now, this kind of creative exercise is an excellent lead-in to a writing exercise because it allows students to turn on this creativity switch, which they may need in a writing exercise to come up with all these ideas that they need in a writing task. So what we have done is a sequence of activities which use the image of Mona Lisa. So let's quickly look at what were the learning aims for this kind of exercise. First of all, modal verbs of speculation. This is when students were speculating about the reasons why Mona Lisa is smiling. And another aim was to practice precise language. And this is when one student was describing their picture and the other student in a pair would draw the same picture without looking at the original and only listening to the description. And precise language is something that is very much needed if you work in professions such as a lawyer, an engineer, or a technician. Now, you'll find many more activities like the ones that we have just done in the book Creativity in English Language Teaching, which you can download from the internet, and you have the QR code and the link to the page where you can download the book on the screen. Okay, so a few minutes ago, we said that we were going to focus on the P's of creativity, which are most important from the point of view of teachers and trainers. And of course, the two P's are people and process. So let's have a look at the creative process. In 1926, Graham Wallas developed a four-stage sequential model of creativity, and this process became known as the Wallas four-stage creative process. And the first stage in the process is preparation. Preparation really is a stage where you conduct a preliminary analysis of a given problem, where you define exactly what the problem is. And you also do work which draws on the knowledge that you have, on your analytical skills, or you gain more knowledge in order to be able to solve the problem at hand. The next stage in the process is the incubation stage. And this is where the mind continues to work on the problem unconsciously, forming, in fact, trains of associations. And this often involves the mind wandering. Now, wandering mind is something that we actually spend about 30% of each day doing. And this is very good for the creative process because incubation is such an important stage in this process. The next stage is the stage of illumination. And this stage is reached when a promising idea breaks through to conscious awareness. And very often it is like a sudden enlightenment. But we have to remember that this is, in fact, a very delicate stage, and it can be disturbed very easily by outside interruptions, or if we try to rush the emerging idea too much. And finally, we've got the stage of verification, and this is where the idea is evaluated, refined, so where the idea is further developed. Now, before we look at what the four-stage creative process, according to Wallas, means to us in practical terms, let's again look at something creative that we can do in the classroom. Now, I'm sure that you will recognize that what you see on the screen are Cuisinart rods which were originally invented to teach kids mathematics and which are now extremely popular with language teachers. And Cuisinart rods can be used for creating stories, pictures, for teaching grammar, for teaching vocabulary. But you can also use them to teach pronunciation. And this is what I would like to show you. I would like to show you how I use Cuisinart rods to teach sentence stress. Okay, so the first stage is putting out 5 Cuisinart rods of equal length. Here I have chosen green rods, and I tell students that these rods represent words in a sentence. And I invite students to try and guess what the sentence is. And with a little bit of guidance and help, students usually are able to come up with the sentence, which is, I think I love you. Now, the next stage is doing this. So you put one of the rods up, or you choose a different color rod. And here, as you can see, I've actually done both at the same time. I've chosen a different color rod and I've put it up a little bit. And this rod, the blue rod, represents the placing of sentence stress. And I invite students to say this sentence now. And of course, they will come up with a sentence, I think I love you. And then I invite students to speculate on the meaning of the sentence, I think I love you. And of course, the meaning is, I'm not sure, I think I love you, but I'm not entirely sure whether I actually love you. And then, of course, you can provide students with a little bit more practice. So on the same sentence, different placing of word stress, and students in pairs or in small groups say the sentence, and they also speculate on the meaning of the sentence with this particular sentence stress. Now, the beauty of practicing pronunciation in this way is that you, the teacher, don't actually need to model anything. Why is it so important? Well, think about how many times when you were trying to teach pronunciation, you have said to yourself, they can't hear the difference. Well, if they can't hear the difference, show them the difference. And this is exactly what we're doing in this activity. So let's look at the 4 stages of the creative process and let's translate them into what actually needs to be done. When we're talking about preparation, there is no escaping hard work. You're not going to be very creative if you don't set the parameters right, if you don't know exactly what you need to work on. In fact, preparation is an absolutely key stage in the creative process. When we're talking about incubation, creativity takes time. Our brain needs to digest the information that we've input into it. And the good news is, if you do it often enough, the incubation period will tend to get shorter and shorter. Moving on from incubation to illumination means that once your brain has been given a task, it will come up with a solution. But what science of our brain tells us is that illumination usually comes after a period of rest or after a period when you've consciously put the thoughts about this particular project aside. And finally, verification means testing if our idea would actually work in a given context. So when verifying, you might find that things actually turn okay, and this is excellent. But more often than not, you will get negative results when verifying, which means that you need to go back to the incubation stage. But if the negative result of the verification stage keeps coming up, then it may be necessary to go back to the very beginning of the process, and that is preparation. Now, in order to analyze the preparation stage, we actually need to look at the other element which is of interest to us, and that's people, and that's us. Research shows that creativity requires 4 elements from us, the people. The first element is fluency, and that is the ability to generate a lot of options. The second element is flexibility. And flexibility is the ability to find options in as many different categories as possible. Then we have originality, and this is the ability to think of unique and novel ideas. And finally, elaboration is the ability to expand on an option in order to make it more interesting and richer. Now, an important part of the how in the creative process is, of course, brainstorming. And brainstorming is a process which supports both fluency, and that's the ability to generate a lot of options, and flexibility, which is the ability to find options in many different categories. And both fluency and flexibility are part of preparation. Now, one important thing about brainstorming is that brainstorming without judgment will guarantee that among many ideas that you've generated, there will be one or two or three which will be really original. And you just need to stop yourself from saying, no, it's not going to work. Okay, so it's perhaps time to step away from talking about creativity, and it's time to engage in doing something creative. The next part of my session will look at some more examples of funny, creative, and innovative, but not very complicated ways of providing language practice to students. First of all, I would like to suggest an activity which uses art and which, just as the Mona Lisa exercise that we did earlier, is extremely useful to those students who need to learn to use precise language. So you choose a picture, and here is a picture that I have chosen, and you cut it into, for example, 4 or 6 pieces, and then you hand the pieces out to students. Now, each student will get one piece, which they can look at, of course, but they must not show it to other students in their group. The student's task is to put the picture back together again, but there are a few important conditions. First of all, they must not show their picture or the piece of the picture to other students. They can only speak, describe the piece that they have, but they must not use gestures when describing. And they have to put the picture together again, face down. Now, this is an activity which generates a pretty incredible amount of speaking on students' part. And of course, depending on the level of the students, you can use more complex pictures, you can use simpler pictures, you can cut those pictures into 4 pieces, 6 pieces. And of course, the more advanced students are, the more pieces you will want to have and the more complex the picture that you will choose. Now, for those of you who are interested in using creative ideas in the classroom, you might also be interested in joining some online groups which focus on creativity, for example, the C group. And here again, you've got a QR code and a link to the C group website. Now, we have looked at some activities in which art plays a central role, and here is another one. Show students the painting that you can see on the right and tell them to answer these questions. And it's a good idea if they answer these questions in pairs or small groups. Once they have answered these questions, once they think they have the right answers, they can check their answers in a reading text. But as you can probably see, there's a bit of an issue with this reading text because first, the students need to put the paragraphs of the text back into the right order. And of course, the right order is this. First comes paragraph E, then C, then D, then A, and B. Once students have ordered the text and checked their answers to the questions from the first stage of the activity, we can play around with language a little bit. So here's just one paragraph from the text, and here is the fragment that we're interested in. And of course, you can recognize that this is passive voice. So the next stage is a little bit of language work. So we've got the phrase that we're focusing on. He is being treated. And we can help students understand or check their understanding by using concept questions. So we can ask them about the time that this phrase refers to, the tense which is used in this fragment of the text, who is the agent in this phrase, who is the subject of the sentence, are the agent and the subject the same person, and finally, what exactly is the sentence structure. And a follow-up to this could be a very simple game where students get a pair of cards and they have to create sentences. For example, the phone was invented by Alexander Bell. Do you remember this guy? Adam Grant. So here are his tips for creativity, which I promised to share with you earlier on in the session. Adam Grant says that when you're working on a new solution, you shouldn't limit yourself to the first 10 ideas that you come up with. Aim for hundreds. And the reason is that the first ideas will be rather conventional, and you need to get past them to get to something creative. And once you have come up with something creative, share it with other people. For brainstorming, Grant suggests working in pairs rather than in larger groups. And this is because studies show that when brainstorming in groups, some people's voices are very often not heard at all. Now, the next one is an interesting idea because we all think that procrastination is bad. Well, in fact, a former student of Grant's ran a couple of studies which showed that people who procrastinate tend to be more creative than people who don't procrastinate. Grant says that creative procrastination is all about making sure that you give yourself enough time to incubate. Now, Grant also gives very interesting parental advice. He says that one mistake that parents often make is that they often encourage their kids to practice a skill or a craft until they become experts. Practice does make perfect, but it doesn't produce creative results. So his best piece of parenting advice is to give the kids the time and the space they need in order to think about doing things their own way, instead of learning from the way it's been done by others. And I would also like to share a couple of tips for cultivating creativity, which are very simple tips that are very good for anybody who would like to develop their creative thinking. First of all, always carry a notebook with you. We all know that creative ideas come to us at very different times of day or night. And sometimes when you don't write this idea straight away, it will simply disappear. The second tip is change routines. We all know that routines are very important to us because they create the feeling of safety and security. But it's equally important to change routines from time to time. But the idea is to change, for example, one routine in a day. So if you always walk to work, then one day choose a different way to walk to work. The next tip is don't ever compare yourself to others and don't worry about what others will say. If you compare yourself to others, there will always be somebody who is better than you, and there will always be somebody who is worse than you. If you want to compare yourself, then compare yourself to yourself. Next tip is go for a walk. We all know that physical activity is excellent for the brain, and it's the fresh and rested and oxygenated brain that you need for creativity to flourish. We all know that when you're very busy, it's very difficult to find the time to actually sit down and think about creative ideas. So one solution would be to actually schedule a creative thinking slot into your day. And it doesn't have to be a long slot. It could be 10-15 minutes, but do make an effort to actually have that slot in your diary. Another tip is if you are the kind of person who works best under pressure, then set the timer and give yourself a task. For example, give yourself 10 minutes to come up with the best caption for a photo. And finally, change perspective. So for example, in 2 or 3 minutes, come up with as many uses for an everyday object as you can. And that everyday object could be a mouse pad or a pen. Now, this is, of course, a great idea for creativity. But when you think about the EFL classroom, this is also a great exercise which helps develop vocabulary. We know that repetition is the foundation of learning. So let's review a little bit. What you can see on the screen are pictures which represent the points that I have just talked about. And let's see if you can remember what's what. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at the pictures and see if you can remember the pointers from the last slide. So let's see, and then I will give you the pointers myself. So of course, the first picture means carry a notebook with you. Then the next one, the one with the clock, is change routines. The next one, don't compare yourself to others and don't worry about what others will say. Next one is pretty easy. Go for a walk, take some exercise. Schedule creative thinking slot into your day. If you are the kind of person who works best under pressure, then set a timer and give yourself time to come up with an interesting or creative idea. And finally, change perspective. To round off, I would like to encourage you to check out our Gallery Teachers website with all the information that you need about the Gallery Teachers workshops. And this is a source of fantastic resources for your continuous professional development. Creativity can be defined in a lot of different ways. For me, creativity is the ability to look at an object, an activity, or a situation from many different perspectives, and being able to see or to produce alternative ways of understanding it, or a range of ideas for solving a problem, or finding possibilities to communicate more effectively. And this ability to see more possibilities, to see beyond the surface, to generate lots of ideas, is what gives you an edge as a teacher, because it means that you will never run out of innovative ideas and ways of doing something in the classroom. And so you will never get bored with your work, because every time you teach a language point, you will teach it slightly differently. And every time you organize a classroom activity, you will tweak it a little bit. And this also means that you will be better able to adapt to students' needs, and that your teaching will be much more focused on the students that you teach, the individual human beings who are your students, rather than on the material that you want to cover. In addition, the fact that you have teaching objectives will never mean that you forget about learning outcomes. Creativity can affect the way you teach as much or as little as you choose it to affect your teaching. I believe that the wider you open the door to creativity in its different forms in your teaching, the more your students will enjoy and benefit from your teaching, and the more you will enjoy the work that you do. One of the most important things when we talk about creativity is understanding that it is not restricted to some people or some activities only. This means that both you and your students can be creative, and that creativity can simply become part of the fabric of what you do in the classroom. I think it's also extremely important to understand why you are doing a particular activity. And this is because once you know the founding principle, you can actually create variations. And this helps maintain both your motivation and the motivation of your students. I would also encourage you to listen to your students, to hear their ideas and appreciate their input into the lesson. If you create an environment in which creativity is noticed and valued, you will see that the level of inventiveness in you and in your students will just keep growing. Also, encourage creativity by doing activities which foster it. For example, activities which involve creating free associations or brainstorming, or activities which are based on works of art. And last, but certainly not least, make sure that you express your appreciation for every kind of creativity. It's hard to disagree with Ken Robinson about the fact that schools kill creativity. It's enough to just look at research, which shows very clearly the fall in terms of level of creativity right after kids start school. And this cannot be a coincidence. There is a whole host of reasons for this, but in many educational systems in the world, there's a very strong focus on standardized testing. And this means the focus on the syllabus rather than on the people you teach, and a focus on quantifiable results. And yet we know that learning is not so easily quantifiable. In addition, teachers often feel harshly judged in their work. On top of it, they may be suffering from insecurity, which is caused by, for example, lack of experience, or bad experience with certain types of courses, or with certain age groups. And all this causes creativity to die a natural death. And it seems to me that the school today is a large-scale machine whose aim is not entirely clear, given the challenges of the modern world. Creativity is what every one of us needs to be able to face these challenges. But until schools become places where these challenges are recognized and their importance acknowledged, it will be increasingly difficult to promote creativity as an essential part of preparing young people for the world outside the classroom.